evolve and get better and better to where the graphics got smoother and smoother and more like real life. And I noticed that young kids in schools, our Apple computers were favorites in schools, but every time we made the graphics look more human, every time we made a voice sound more human, the kids were more attracted to using the computer for education. I watched the development of music on computers, keyboards that you could play songs and put music scales up, and it would display what you had played. You could play along and record multi-track style. This was before MIDI came. A fellow named Jeff Raskin came to Apple, and he probably more than any one other single individual is responsible for Apple's reputation to this day of building computers that are easy to use. Jeff told Steve Jobs and I, you could choose one set of parts for a computer or another set of parts for the computer, and they can both calculate and do the job equivalently. But if you put a lot of your own effort in and your own brain in, and you work and work and work to make the computer easy to use, so that someone who knows nothing about the innards of computers, somebody who's never seen one before, they can walk up and start learning from a little manual or no manual at all, learning how to use the computer. What you've done is you have modified the technology to fit the human, rather than modifying the human to fit the technology. Jeff Raskin took Steve Jobs and I and others down to Xerox PARC Center in Palo Alto, where they had a new type of computer. It was going to cost $50,000, but it had windows that would pop up on the screen. And it had a mouse and little buttons you could press and bring up menus and choices. And we looked at this computer, and Steve Jobs said, look, Woz designed this real simple machine that did the work of what used to cost so much money. That's Apple's forte in the world. That's what we're good at. We'll take this technology and we'll build a low-cost version for the masses. And that was our relationship with Xerox and the start of our Lisa computer, the first graphical interface computer for personal computers, for the people in their homes. And we built the Lisa, and we had this incredible testing method, believing in Jeff Raskin's words that even a young child should be able to use the computer right off the bat without any instruction. We had a room, a closed room, with two-way windows, so we could look through. There was a mirror to the other person. It was a mirror. But we could watch them, and we put a person in front of the machine and say, try to do what you can with this machine. And then we would leave the room. Nobody to talk to, nobody to ask a question to. And we would observe, and they might discover that this little mouse thing moved, and it moved a cursor on the screen. And then we'd watch them discover there were words on the screen that they could click on, and icons. And we tested one-button mouses, two-button mouses, mouses of different shapes, three-button mouses. We tested menus in every program, just one menu. We found out what worked the best for a person coming up not knowing anything. Obviously, if an expert who knows it all comes up, they can use it too. So, it's funny, but sometimes that's wrong. So we tested and tested. This Lisa was a great computer, but to build a modern graphical user interface computer, even in black and white, no color at all, it cost, for 1 megabyte of memory in those days, cost $5,000. So the computer cost $10,000, and we didn't sell very many to people in their homes, just a few to businesses. Steve Jobs likes to tell people, one of his strengths is being able to tell people that what they've got is not good enough. It's not quality. It's not an advance for the world. And so he was acting like that around the Lisa people, and they kicked him out. They wouldn't let him in their building because he was just bothering them too much, and they were very bright academics and all. So Steve went over to the Macintosh group. I was working in the Macintosh group designing processors because my favorite, most fun to talk to, most fun to joke with people, the greatest, most open minds of all were all working on Macintosh by coincidence. The fellow that changed Apple, Jeff Raskin, was running the project. Well, Steve Jobs came over to the Macintosh group to take it over as sort of a low-cost Lisa to compete with the Lisa. Around that time, I had a plane crash as a pilot, and after I came out of amnesia 5 weeks later, I phoned Steve Jobs and said, well, I'm going to take a leave from Apple, and I'm going to go back to college for 1 year and get my degree. And I went back to Berkeley, and I used a fake name because Apple was pretty famous by then. The name I used was Rocky Raccoon Clark. And that's what it says on my Berkeley diploma. So, I did return to Apple after some time, put on some rock concerts, and music's always been a big part of my life. You know, insights into what life's about, and I'm even planning more concerts in the future, believe it or not. But I came back to Apple and worked on an advanced version of the Apple II. Our Apple III had died, the lease had sort of died. The company never really had any hits since the Apple II. And I worked on a project called the Apple IIX that became the Apple II GS, a new line of Apple II computers. Networking. Computers started changing to networking. I'm not going to go too much further because by this point in time, Apple was big, successful. We went public. We raised so much money. Steve Jobs and I looked at each other and just sort of, it's hard to believe how wealthy you were. But the laser writer was one of these projects that came out of Xerox. And the laser writer was a very expensive printer. You couldn't afford to buy a computer for $2,000 and a laser writer for $4,000. But 10 people in an office could share one laser writer if we networked it. So we developed a little low-speed network, and it was our first network in personal computers. And as computers shifted over to networking, that's the direction I went personally too. And eventually we were wiring up all of our schools, and I would crimp the wires together to do that. I was very close to the schools. And then I provided internet to the schools and learned how to program routers. I got into the internet very early. At my father's wake, Steve Jobs said to me that he had extended what was called a T1, high-speed digital line, from the internet to his house. So I went out and I was scared to learn how to do this, but I did, and I got my own T1 line, and was so early in the internet, I managed to get a 3-letter .com, Woz.com. But then I looked at myself, and I care about people, and I'm more like nonprofits and museums, so I always use Woz.org instead. I never use my .com, where everybody else wants to get a .com with their name. At some point in time, I got involved with a lot of startups. I like small startup companies with 5 engineers, 15 people total, and you're talking about these new ideas and new projects that never existed. I love startups. I loved Apple when it was a startup. Now Apple's a huge company. So I would go off and start companies for various technical projects and just for fun. And then I got involved with a lot of philanthropy, starting museums in San Jose, and then I got involved with, I had my own children by then. I got involved in the schools. And what would you do if you had a lot of money? In those days, you would donate computer labs to schools. But I thought, donating money, donating computers, when you have a lot of money, it's not important. It's easy. What you really have to give if you care about something, education, you have to give yourself. You have to give your own time. So I started teaching classes voluntarily of the 5th graders. I've taught them how to use the computer to make your homework for all the normal school subjects the best. I taught them how to be on networks and communicate with faraway people. Always taught them how to take care of your computer. And I wound up teaching for 8 years. I taught teachers, I taught young children, I taught older children, and I would teach 7 days a week, writing all the classes myself. And I just loved teaching. I loved being able to carry this personally to other people. So, the cultural values of Apple over time, from our very start, were that we were going to build the technology that was a little better than everyone else's, a little more state-of-the-art, a little finer design. In the Apple II computer, I had done all of the computer design, but Steve Jobs designed the first plastic case ever for a computer. He was in charge of that project. To this day, when Steve does something early in his life, that becomes the important essence of what he does from then on. So to Steve Jobs to this day, style and design, cases, housings, how the electronics is put inside is the important part. People don't really care what microprocessors inside. They don't really care that much about the speed. They just want to know how it works to solve their problems at work and home, or to play their games even. So, and that's pretty much the philosophy that Apple goes by.